Uh, so what was it about poetry that appealed to you?
That's a great question. I guess it wasn't so much of an active choice that I made when I was
Mm-hmm.
younger to write. Uh, my dad's a musician and my mom's a
Mm-hmm.
writer, so I was just raised around a lot of art.
Okay.
And like one of my earliest memories is waking up from my dad had a big pillow in the bass drum of his drum set
Uh-huh.
in his studio, and I remember waking up from falling asleep on there, and everybody thought it was really funny that I fell asleep in the bass drum. So I was always surrounded by music and words and stuff like that, and it just came naturally to me. I would say later in my 20s, I kind of got away from it for a few years, like particularly when I was doing my master's degree, my PhD. I was reading and writing so much other stuff. I had to kind of force myself to get back to it after that. And so the last several years, it's gotten back to be part of my everyday life, but for about 4 or 5 years, about 5 years when I was in my 20s, I kind of got away from it, and it kind of hurt, not doing
Right.
it every day. So yeah, that's how I kind of at first it wasn't a decision, it was just part of life, and then later I was like, I got to do it, so I made a decision to get back into it.
All right.
Yeah.
That's interesting. How would you define poetry?
Oh man. So one of my favorite writers, a guy named Amiri Baraka, he used to be, a great poet from New Jersey. he he said he said that poetry is a genre of music, and
Yeah, I suppose it is. They're definitely very connected, I would say.
yeah. So I mean, you could draw some lines there. They're not totally the same, but for me, it's something that just makes very creative use of the words,
Mm-hmm.
both the sound, the meaning, and when you're writing poetry, also how they look on the page. You can do a lot of interesting things that you wouldn't necessarily hear when someone reads it, but when you see it on the page, you can mess with the words in ways that affect how people interpret it. So one uh one of the best pieces of advice I got, which might help this answer this, is from one of my poetry, a poet I knew when I was doing my bachelor's degree. He used to always say, "You got to put pressure on the words.
Mm-hmm.
Put pressure on the words." So I'd say it's kind of anywhere where people are putting pressure on the words, whether that's like someone's like, "I'm doing a poem now," or even if you're just talking to somebody and they are really creative with how they speak. They find new ways to open up. The sort of magic in language. That's how I think about it.
Ah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, that same music is sort of what got me into poetry,
Okay.
being a musician.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so I was going to also get a little bit more of the specifics about your style of poetry.
Mhm.
So I did some research. In this one source, it it mentioned 10 different eras of poetry. I guess different eras of, and I can't remember all of them, but I think there was the early Greek versions, and then there was the transcendentalism, romanticism, and
That's the,
modernism. So I want to see which one of those really appeals to you. Which do you identify with?
oh, that's a great question. I think, you know, I identify with a lot of different sort of periods of poetry or
Mm.
styles of poetry. Um, I would say I've been most influenced by modernists.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, I used to read a lot of like Langston Hughes, a lot of E. E. Cummings, a lot of Wallace Stevens, early 20th century American poets. Particularly when I was in middle school and in high school, um, part of that was an accident. I went to a book sale when I was like 12 with my mom. This was in Eugene, Oregon. The library used to have a book sale every year and get rid of old books. And I bought this old college textbook for creative writing. I still have it. I don't think I have it in here. I do. This blue one right here. And I keep it around because I just happened to pick it up and it has tons of modernist poetry in there.
Yeah.
And so I just started reading it, just the poetry parts. I wasn't interested in the other parts of it, the fiction and the playwriting, whatever. But I was really interested in the poetry, and I just started wading in. And then, but I used to also read a lot of really old school poetry, old English stuff. Obviously kind of updated and translated. But I love to read Beowulf. I love to read some of these early anonymous um, poems and that you'll find in any kind of poetry anthology, like Western poetry anthology will have some really old ones in there that don't have authors anymore. We don't know who wrote them, but they're traditional things. Um, I used to love those a lot too. So it's kind of hard to say exactly one. I would say personally, my writing doesn't come off like that so much. I used to write like a very fixed rhyme and meter, um, but I pretty much write free blank verse these days. So there is some rhyme in there here and there, but mostly I use it. I'd say in a more of a postmodern way, in a way that's sort of playful with that stuff. Like try to use sort of romantic and modernist modes, but in a more playful way and mix it up with a lot of different styles. So I would say in general, I'm a product of postmodernism, like most writers today are.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
That's cool. Yeah. Yeah. I'm kind of similar. I mean I compose piano music a little bit,
Uh-huh.
and I generally like the well of course I mainly listen to classical, but I like more the classical modernist. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um. So another thing I wanted to I researched was about different poetic forms, like narrative, lyric, stuff like that. Also, I wanted to get a glimpse into what kind of performance you like.
So I would say I'm more towards the lyric end.
The lyric.
Yeah,
Okay.
in the sense that, I mean, in a way, it's kind of going back to what I said about the pressure on the words. So, like, narrative poetry definitely, it's different than just, like, everyday talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's more geared towards the storytelling aspect. If you look
Right.
at, like, an old epic or something like that, there are some, like, poetic aspects there, but it's much more geared towards, like, conveying a story.
Right.
With that said, I think, some of my poems definitely have an element of the narrative in them. So some of my poems are like 3 or 4 pages long, and they do tell at least part of a story. There's a narrative kind of impulse there, we'd say,
Yeah.
but it doesn't really follow through with it. So I'm not really trying to resolve the story, Like I might have a little snapshot or something of a series of events, but the main thing that's motivating is the lyric impulse of it.
Right.
You go back to, we're talking about the relationship with music.
Yeah.
The sort of musical roots of the form are in song, lyric, so that's more, I'm more interested in the sound.
Yeah, I think that's more consistent with your idea of like the postmodern, like more free verse kind of poems.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then are there any types of poetic techniques that you like to use? Is like the rhymes or like figurative language or meter that you think plays an important role in your poem?
Yeah. I don't know that I don't have a specific one that I try to like dial in all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I think it helped that for a long time I wrote in verse, like in meter,
Right.
especially in rhyme, because I'm comfortable using those on some
Mhm.
levels, but also I don't like to use them a lot. Like a
Mhm.
lot of postmodern writers, I mean, it's just something that's descriptive of postmodern writer. You don't want to be defined so much by like older sort of forms,
Yeah.
And so we think we're all free and everything. In reality, we're products of our time and age, like anybody else. But
Right.
I do like to use, a lot of different conventions in my writing, but not too much. Like almost just to point them out. So
Yeah.
see, I just did a couplet. All right, now I'm moving on. You know what I'm saying? So that's kind of like how they come in. I will say this though, a lot of writers who are more lyric poets, or especially if they're poets who are more page based that never perform or don't perform much, they don't. I think I pay more attention to the sound of stuff when you read it than a lot of page based writers. But I'm not exactly like a slam poet. You know what I'm saying? Like there's some gray area that I exist in between. And I don't have a problem with either of those things. It's just not how I write. It doesn't. I come out somewhere in the middle of those things.
Mm-hmm.
So I really do try to have a rhythm. Here's my point. I try to have a really distinctive rhythm.
Yeah.
To the pieces. It's something about it just seems necessary to me.
Mm-hmm.
I can't stand it when I read something I've written and it doesn't have a rhythm or it doesn't sound like it's meant to be spoken. So there are aspects there of, I guess, maybe older forms, that the really like more traditional lyric that really still I don't even feel a need to move away from. I really like to listen to it, either myself read or other poets read, who have especially other poets who have a very musical ear, even if it's not a straight rhyme and meter sort of thing, So I guess that's a convention.
Yeah. So in some ways, you kind of like combining like the sort of old and newer influences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also, what do you think of like the current state of poetry at the time? I know that the article I read was seemed was very sort of outright, and like the person, as a magazine news article said, poetry is dead. I'm like, I don't know about that, but I just wanted, but it just raised the question, what do you think is about poetry at the time?
It is. So my feeling is like anything right now, it's like mass produced.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of it out there.
Yeah.
There's, in fact, one of the biggest criticisms is people say if all poets read the journals that they try to publish in,
Yeah.
we'd be in a much better place. But the reality is partially because there's so many MFA programs out there, creative writing, master's programs. And partially just because we live in this sort of digital age. We're so overexposed. There's so much out there, just all the time. It creates an effect where it seems like it's not that good.
Yeah.
But what I would say though is, I can go through these phases where I'm really disenchanted. Like I haven't read, like I'll subscribe to American Poetry Review is a sort of standard poetry journal out there. It happens every few years. I just cancel my subscription because I won't have read a decent poem in the American Poetry Review in like a year or two, And I'm like, why do I pay for this thing? But then somehow, some way, usually through social media or something like that, I'll come across a new poet who's just amazing.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So there is definitely great poetry out there, really innovative stuff. It's not, not all of it's going to correspond with, what's interesting to me, but I do believe it's still a very important thing. Very actually, there are important things going on in poetry now.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of hard to find them in certain ways, and also to separate it from the hype because there's like any art form. There's some people who have become the famous ones, and they sort of kind of like are seen as like these are it. Mm-hmm. That's not necessarily where the innovation is going on, so it's kind of hard to separate it out. I will say as a poet, a lot of times I feel like I'm like a classical musician. You know what I'm saying? Because, it could be at the highest level. I could be doing stuff that I can have these amazing innovations in my own work.
Yeah.
Or I see them in other people's and no one cares. You know what I'm saying? But, some people do. And occasionally you get like, someone will pick up on your wavelength. They'll see something you wrote somewhere. Or you get picked up by a journal you really respect or whatever. And then you're like, okay, there's a heartbeat out there. There's a real scene. Somebody gets me, So as a poet, a lot of times internally, I just feel like I'm just like writing for like classical cello or something like that. That's what it feels like a lot of times.
That's interesting. Yeah. So let's see what time. 1 minute. So just real quick, how has poetry influenced your life?
Whew, man, that's a great question. I mentioned at the beginning of the interview that I came back to it after taking a few years off. And I came back to it because I just, it's fundamental,
Mm-hmm.
It's just fundamental. So what I started thinking about is it's something I can do or not do, but if I don't do it, it's just going to eat me alive. It's almost like it's in me, and if I don't let it out, it's like almost like toxic if I don't let it out.
Right.
I know it sounds a little nuts, but that's how I was thinking about it at the time. Like, I hadn't been writing for about 4 or 5 years at that point, and I was like, I don't feel healthy.
Right.
It's almost like it just builds up. So the influence is like when I'm writing regularly and just, not thinking about the consequences, not putting too much pressure on myself. When I'm writing regularly, I'm a happy person, and that's just what it is.
All right. That's